The man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. So begins Stephen King's epic saga, The Dark Tower, which spans novels, comic books, video games, and a feature film. Now it's time for us to talk about The Dark Tower. The Dark Tower is up there with Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and Game of Thrones as some of the most important and influential fantasy writing of the modern era. That's why IGN assembled a team of experts, our own quartet, made up of IGN senior editor Marty Sleva, executive editor Andrew Goldfarb, and associate editor Jonathan Dornbush, where we're going to break down some of the more complicated mythology of the series, but also explain why we're so excited about it. Now, you guys, you all have read the series before, multiple times, Andrew, as you told us before, 4 times. But I'm sure over the years you've been pitching it to your friends and family and trying to convince them, why they should be so excited about it. So I want to hear, what's your elevator pitch for the series? How did you get people on board in the past?
So, first off, I got chills at the intro when you read the first line of the book. And honestly, to me, that first line encompasses why I love this so much. It's The Dark Tower as a whole is sort of this awesome micro and macro story where you have this really personal, amazing story of Roland the Gunslinger and the Man in Black and sort of the quartet he forms of these amazing characters. But at the same time, if you pull the camera back, you have this insane 9-mile-high story that spans all of Stephen King's books and all these other fantasy books, and it's storytelling in a way that very few things ever really accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, it's the scope of it is crazy. I think that's something that's really important to realize, just what you're getting yourself into when you start this. But for me, it's always been about it's not just the hero's journey. It's not just a story trope that we see every once in a while. It's all of them, and it does such a good job of balancing. It makes you care about those characters, but it's also feels so grand and big the entire time.
And I read the whole series over about a year and a half, and for me, what grabbed me so much and what I try to convince other people about, it's very lit nerdy if you're in college it works, but it's sort of the whole series itself is a commentary on storytelling and the importance of it because it's something we all do, and that's a big factor in the books, and that's why I love it.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the weird things is when the movie got announced and people were like, why should we care about that? We're trying to explain to people in the office and we just sound insane because it's but it's a Western, but it's a fantasy, but then there's horror and Stephen King appears and it's you sound nuts, please slow down.
So that actually leads us well to our next point, because I'm sure most people have probably heard of The Dark Tower. Yeah. It's one of Stephen King's biggest epics. Obviously, everyone knows who Stephen King is, but once you get past Roland the Gunslinger, you don't necessarily, the rest of it probably gets hazy for people, right?
Yeah.
So obviously, Gunslinger, he's a knight with guns instead of swords.
Yes. Yep.
Yes.
That's probably the number one thing you need to understand about it. But let's sort of break down what are the key details people need to understand to sort of get what the Dark Tower is going in.
Yeah, I mean, Roland is very much a sort of a Clint Eastwood type. He's the man with no name, and his sort of ongoing journey of literally that first line of the Man in Black fleeing across the desert and him following shows that he's this man who will go to the ends of the earth or the ends of Midworld, which is the setting of the story, in order to sort of achieve his goal and honor everyone who fell before him.
And the fact that he has a goal, right? I think the most important thing is that it's Roland fulfilling what he set out to do.
Which is to get to the Dark Tower.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
It's that whole quest, but it gets so much more complex as it goes on, but that's sort of the basis, the nut of it.
And he's a man who he's lost everyone and everything in his past, mostly due to the Man in Black. And so this is one of those things where he also seems like a dog chasing a car, where it's all right, so when you get to him, what are you going to do with him? Yeah. Are you going to murder him? Are you going to talk to him?
Have a tea party maybe?
Yeah, exactly. He's a character who feels like he should be on his own, who throughout the course of this is not. And I think it's an important thing, him realizing the value of having other people and that you don't have to do it yourself and things like that.
Yeah, and there's sort of the characters obviously expand so much throughout the 7 books, 8 if you count Wind in the Keyhole. But the movie seems to be focusing on the triangle of Roland chasing the Man in Black, the Man in Black chasing this boy Jake, who's a boy who lives in New York City in our world, who is having dreams of Roland, and then obviously through those dreams, Jake is chasing Roland, which is sort of a cool, I don't know, I really like that triangle aspect.
And it's very cyclical, which is important to the Dark Tower.
Yeah, which is without going into spoilers, is very important to sort of the mythos of the Dark Tower as a whole.
And what's interesting about the way they are adapting this is it's not, the first novel in the series is called The Gunslinger, and that's very much about Roland the Man in Black and Jake, but this isn't a direct adaptation of that. It's actually drawing stuff all the way to the end of the series. There's this big bad, the Crimson King, and he's already established as part of this story. So it is interesting how they're bringing all those pieces together. Obviously, Idris Elba is playing Roland, and Matthew McConaughey is playing the Man in Black, which is awesome to see those two together. But the way, and again, not getting into spoilers, but the way they're sort of explaining why this is different than the books makes sense within the context of the books, which is something I think is really, really cool and smart to die-hard fans.
I feel like the best explanation I've heard is that take a look at superhero movies and take a look at the modern movies like The Avengers or something. It's like, well, they didn't create Iron Man and Captain America. They're drawing upon decades of history of these characters, but it's a sort of new telling of this character, which totally makes sense. Again, without spoiling it, in the context of the story, especially with some of the promo images we've seen, especially with some of the getting into very nerdy details, some of the items, some of the characters are
their very first image we saw immediately meant something to readers, but I think the way they're going to do it, it's almost like the Star Trek reboots and things like that, where I feel like if you know the history, if you've seen other adaptations, then you get it and you have kind of a foundation. But if you come as a new person, you're going to be totally fine and be able to keep up.
So let's briefly talk about some of those key elements that people who maybe haven't read the book should keep an eye out for. I will say, for example, 19 is a very important number to Stephen King. He was 19 when he wrote The Gunslinger, first and foremost, but that's something that keeps coming up throughout the series.
Yeah, you get these, it sort of reminds me a lot of like something like Lost or House of Leaves or these works where you really like, it gives you more the more you put into it. So the more you not only read the Dark Tower books, but other Stephen King books, the more you it starts referencing things outside the realm of Stephen King, like The Wizard of Oz and Harry Potter and everything. And so it's sort of the more you arm yourself with, the more you get out of the story, which is really cool to me.
So that's going to do it for our show today, but never fear, there are other topics than these. So make sure to keep it here on IGN for all things The Dark Tower.